So it's a big deal, and it's a reason to celebrate. It's an accomplishment. It is something that goes on with you in life. So this is kind of our moment as a faculty to celebrate the accomplishment of one of our dear members, Professor Gregory Gordon. So I will start by the order of the table. We have our main presenter, Professor Gregory Gordon, who is now a full professor here at PKU-STL from last year. Before that, he was tenured at Chinese University of Hong Kong Law School, and before that at the University of North Dakota School of Law. He is, as he wants to say, Berkeley through and through. So he went to the BA in Berkeley University, where he did Phi Beta Kappa afterwards, if you know what that is, and then afterwards Berkeley Law School and a federal clerkship. He then became a specialist in international criminal law, which is what we're going to discuss today. He served as both a legal officer and deputy team leader in the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, and then he was a federal prosecutor at the DOJ Tax Division and Criminal Division before he decided to shift into academia. He is very, very widely published, so I'm not going to mention many of his articles. He did write a book about incitement to genocide, which I think is very relevant to our discussion. So the book we're talking about today, Nuremberg Citizen Prosecutor, Benjamin Ferencz, that's how I say it?
There it is, right here.
So commenting on this beautiful talk, we have two of our illustrious faculty members. First, we have Professor Dimitry Kochenov, who is a visitor at STL and a research professor in the Central European University in Budapest. And he is quite literally one of the leading voices on citizenship, immigration law, investment law in the world, and we're very, very blessed to have him here. If you want to read some of his work, I'm currently reading his book called Citizenship, which is a marvelous, marvelous read. Next to him, and does not require an introduction to the people in the room, is our very own Professor Kevin Gray, who is an assistant professor here at STL, a incredibly a prolific writer and teacher, and they will both comment after the talk. So we're going to start with the book talk and have two comments, and then we will open for questions and answers. The reason why I'm leaving is to procure water for Professor Gordon.
Although my wife may be coming with something, so yeah.
Fine. But I will still, I'm coming back. Okay, please.
I think you're good. I think Annie will take care of it.
Okay,
Yeah, don't worry about it. You can stay. Thank you so much. So, yeah, this is, I recently just got my own copy of the book, which is pretty incredible. I had a shipment to China that got lost, and so I've now had to get a couple of books, and it's great to hold it in my hand here in my home institution, where I'm very, very honored. Thank you to Professor Gilad and to my co-moderators, and to my wife for bringing me some water, thank you. And for a lot of other things that she does, she's amazing. But I really appreciate having the opportunity to present my book here at my own home institution. I've been traveling around the world presenting, and we'll be doing some more. And this is, if you will, this is sort of like the midpoint. And it just seems entirely fitting that I would do it here now. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about the background and the origins of the project. And then I want to give you an outline of Ben Ferencz's life as he told his story, because he lived to be 103, and he told the story many times, and he had a standard narrative. And I figured everybody was like looking at me and laughing, and I figured maybe I had just gone to the bathroom, so I'm glad that I didn't forget to do anything that I needed to after I finished. But I want to then look at the structure of that standard narrative, and then I want to talk about the revelations that I made in my research. This has been a 7-year project. I had some amazing moments, research discoveries, and I want to talk about those. And then I have some concluding thoughts. So this book represents the culmination of a lot of inspiration in my life. I studied the Holocaust and the Nuremberg Trials, especially the Einsatzgruppen case, when I was a student. And Ben Ferencz was a hero of mine and a guiding figure as I transitioned into human rights prosecution and then scholar. I had the incredible opportunity to meet him for the first time in 2010. And I have to say, just as an aside, today it so happens in my international criminal law class, I was teaching aggression, the crime of aggression, just a total coincidence. And it was in the context of the crime of aggression that I first met Ben Ferencz, because we were in Kampala in 2010 to negotiate, I say we, I was with a non-governmental organization, kind of more on the sidelines, but trying to help with a definition and a jurisdictional operational scheme for the crime of aggression, because aggression had been included in the International Criminal Court statute in 1998, but because of a lot of political, if you will, tension, it was not defined. And so it was left for a later conference, and that was in Kampala, Uganda in 2010. Ben Ferencz was a legend, and he was known for his work on aggression, which I will talk about. And here I was, sort of face to face for the first time with my hero. You can see that's the first photograph we ever took together in Kampala, which is pretty amazing. And it was around this time that I was working on my first book, Atrocity Speech Law. And I stayed in touch with the Ferencz family. I actually established a good relationship with his son, Don. I was invited to an event honoring Ben Ferencz in The Hague. And the abbreviated version is that Don invited me to write a biography of his father. They wanted to have a definitive English language biography. And I was extremely busy. I had a lot on my plate, but I decided that here is somebody who at the time was almost 100 years old and was, could have died any moment. So I decided to drop all my other projects and take this on. And I actually applied for a year of sabbatical leave. I was granted sabbatical, and I spent a dedicated year doing research and starting the writing process for this book. It's funny, I took my sabbatical in Florence. Many of you may know that in Italian, Florence is called Firenze. And so I often tell people that this was my year of doing Ferencz and Firenze. And that usually gets a couple chuckles. But let me then talk about what it was like to actually do this work. You can see the image on the right is my trusty Nikon camera. I spent time in the archives coming across some amazing documents. Actually, that camera took a photo of some documents I'm going to show you in a little bit, which is some of the archival research that I uncovered, which is really, really exciting. But I felt like I had to look at Ben Ferencz's life as more than just a Nuremberg prosecutor. And when I was doing that archival digging, I wanted to look at his career and his legacy in the years both before Nuremberg and after Nuremberg. And what I realized was that probably the most incredible achievement of his career was not being a Nuremberg prosecutor. In fact, it was representing victims of atrocity, and in particular Holocaust survivors, and that he was an incredible pioneer and never got enough recognition for that. And so I needed to, I felt like his work for victims was the golden thread that would go through the biography. I kind of figured that fairly early on. I worked diligently. I wanted to get him a copy. I wanted him to be able to read the whole biography, and we would often have phone conversations, especially after COVID, when I couldn't visit him in person. And he had a very funny, very characteristic, raspy voice. He grew up in New York, and he'd say something like, "Where's my biography?" He would always be asking me things like that, and I'd say, "I'm working on it, Ben. I'll get it to you as soon. Hurry up!" We would joke. I have all these hours and hours of recordings of the two of us speaking, and all these wonderful little moments like that. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2023 before we could get the book finalized. And He had, however, I had shared many passages with him, and he had read a lot of the book, or at least significant portions. And so he actually wrote me a wonderful letter, and it's now the foreword to the book. So at the very beginning of the book, you'll see a foreword by Ben Ferencz, and I'll just give you, he was very pleased, and he graciously endorsed the project, and just a quick quote from it. Given the accounts of my life story, I know of no other author whose research and writing style combined have borne such satisfying results, exceptionally poignant, informative, and powerful. When I got that letter, I told my publisher, I'd like to put that in the book. And so that, as I said, that's now the foreword. So what I want to do now, as I said in my outline, is talk about his standard account of his life. And the way I want to do that is I want to take the parts of the book, the way the book is structured, and give you that account through the way I've structured it. Now, some of you know that I like to write poetry, and I love alliteration. You could tell from if you look at my book, by the way, I meant to say, I should have mentioned this. You see my first book that Professor Abiri referred to, it's Atrocity Speech Law, Foundation, Fragmentation, Fruition. Ben Ferencz wrote the foreword to that, and that's, I think, how his family found out about my writing. But you could tell from the subtitle, Foundation, Fragmentation, Fruition, how much I love alliteration. And so I fast forward to this. Look at the parts of my book: prelude, preparing, probing, prosecuting, providing, and preventing. Now, when I first presented this to my editor, she said, "No way, that's too cute." And then she read the manuscript and she said, "You know what? It works." And so that's the structure that I'm presenting to you. Let's take a look and see that each part of this has this focus on victims, and that's what I'm going to talk about, okay? And you can begin with, there's a prologue, actually, in addition, leading into the prelude. And in that, I begin with the thing that he's best known for. When I say he's a Nuremberg prosecutor, he's best known for being the chief prosecutor of the Einsatzgruppen trial. I'll talk about the Nuremberg trials, but this was the 9th trial. The first one is recently the object of a book that is now a movie that is based on a book about the psychiatric evaluation of the Nuremberg defendants. That was the first trial. That movie came out in December, and actually the author of that book has asked to come to STL and do a joint presentation with me. So we're going to see if we can make that work in the fall. But the other trials, the additional trials, were themed trials. There was a doctor's trial, there was a judge's trial or lawyer's trial. The judge's or lawyer's trial was the basis of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, the famous movie. And so Ben Ferencz was the chief prosecutor of one of those trials, and it was the trial against the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were special Nazi units of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which was the sort of security apparatus of the Nazi terror regime. They followed the Wehrmacht after the invasion of the Soviet Union, and they were killing civilian enemies as they perceived them, primarily Jews. And many refer to this as the first stage of the Holocaust by bullets. And so his opening statement at that trial describes, I say in the book, what led up to that moment and what it foretold about his future. His Jewish family fleeing persecution in Europe and then trying to survive on Hell's Kitchen streets. Hell's Kitchen was a slum in New York City at that time, one of the worst crime-ridden slums in the United States. And this motivated a long and pioneering quest to represent atrocity victims, the kinds of victims he saw on the street in New York City, in Hell's Kitchen. This is covered in chapters 1 and 2. He then gets a scholarship to University of New York, and he's a sociology major there, a gifted student, financially needy, and he works really hard, and he focuses on helping juvenile delinquents, which again, he perceived as victims of the kind of slum where he was growing up. And there's some really cool passages of him doing this kind of work. And this really forms him in terms of trying to help victims. The Children's Village in Dobbs Ferry, New York, for example, is one of the things he did as an internship. This is covered in Chapter 3. Preparing covers his time at Harvard Law School. He was a scholarship student there. He worked as a research assistant for a Professor Sheldon Gluck. I talked about how poor he was. Even though he had a scholarship to study at Harvard, he could barely get enough to eat. And so he was constantly looking for opportunities to make money. One of those was a federal program that allowed students to work as research assistants and get paid. And he ended up working with a criminal law expert by the name of Sheldon Gluck, who happened to be writing a book on Nazi war crimes. This was a huge turning point in his life. Gluck was giving him reports from the London International Assembly of the League of Nations that were dealing with trials and punishments of war criminals. And these reports detailed Nazi atrocities and had a tremendous impact on Ferencz. He later noted, quote, "I was very much aware that Jews in Poland were being exterminated, and his passionate concern for the victims of the Holocaust began here." This is covered in Chapter 4. In Chapters 5 and 6, we learn about his time in the Army. He graduates from Harvard in 1943, and he's drafted into the Army. And despite his Harvard education, he's made a supply clerk in an artillery unit, an anti-aircraft artillery battalion, the 115th AAA Gun Battalion, in General George Patton, the famous general, in his Third Army. And while Ferencz appreciated fighting against the despicable Nazis, he also witnessed certain horrors that sensitized him to the largely inhumane nature of war, describing the profound impact it had on him. And this is a passage I got from his diary. I found some great stuff in his diaries. He says, "Their bodies were black and bloated, and I could smell them as I approached. The truck slowed down, and I got a good look. A million maggots were crawling at his face, forming blacker splotches on the black background. It all seemed unhuman, unreal." So he has a really, I'd say, formative experience as a soldier. And I'd say part of the reason that he becomes an anti-war person is related to this. But you're going to see that I think that there are deeper reasons as well. Probing covers his time as a war crimes investigator. In December 1944, as Patton's Third Army was about to cross into Germany from France, he was transferred to the judge advocate section of Patton's Third Army, where he soon became a lead war crimes investigator, innovatively devising procedures and protocols on the fly while finding ways to treat victims with care and respect. I'm doing a PhD thesis at University of Stockholm, and the innovations that he started as a war crimes investigator, I am going to examine along with other innovations in relation to victims from a normative perspective, because there are a lot of amazing things he did. That's going to be my PhD thesis. But it was amazing to find out about this in the context of this research on what he was doing. He was making it up as he went along. He was an incredible pioneer in war crimes investigation. Now, I'm going to give you a point, which I'm going to come back to. He claims that, remember, he was in the 115th AAA Gun Battalion. He claims that he was plucked out of obscurity to run Patton's War Crimes Investigative Unit thanks to his former Harvard Law professor, Sheldon Gluck's behind-the-scene intervention, okay? Keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that, okay? This is covered in Chapter 7. His work became much grimmer while moving deeper into Germany in the spring of 1945. Investigating concentration camps required Ferencz to innovate even more as he collected evidence of unimaginable barbarities in charnel houses such as Buchenwald, Mauthausen, and Ebensee. Through these probes, he learned how best to uncover key documents and forensic evidence, as well as develop effective techniques for interviewing abused, dying prisoners. He also investigated Nazi art plundering, but let me also flag something. He treated this as marginal. He almost treated it as a joke. If you read his online memoirs, he almost facetiously talks about the work that he did on this, but I'm going to come back to this, and I think we're going to see through my research that it was a lot more significant what he did in respect of these art plundering investigations. So this is covered in chapters 8 and 9. Then we get to what he's best known for, which is prosecuting. This is from 1946 to 1948. On arriving in Nuremberg, so he's discharged from the army in December of 1945. He's honorably discharged. And then, amazingly, people don't realize this, but he actually was accepted into the master's program, the LLM program at Columbia in New York City, and was going to do business law. And he was looking to join a Wall Street firm and do corporate law. And he happened to come across one of his former law school classmates as he was walking through the Wall Street area, a guy named Murray Gartner, who happened to be clerking for U.S. Supreme Court Robert Jackson. Robert Jackson was the chief prosecutor for the United States at the first Nuremberg trial. And Gartner says, you know, I'm clerking for Jackson. Jackson's off in Nuremberg. I'm here in the States. And Ferencz says, I've just been doing war crimes investigations. And it would seem that Gartner contacted Jackson's staff in Nuremberg. And it turns out that Jackson's #1 lieutenant, a guy named Telford Taylor, was going to be taking over for Jackson after the first Nuremberg trial. And he would be the chief prosecutor for the subsequent trials, the ones I told you about, those themed trials. And so Ferencz is called to the Pentagon. And he actually has it turns out it was not just Jackson staff that wanted to talk to him, but also the US Army. He had been helping the Army prepare for the Dachau trials. These were trials of concentration camp personnel primarily at the former Dachau concentration camp. And in fact, Ferencz testified at one of those trials because a lot of his investigative work helped prepare for those trials. And he was asked to actually continue as a prosecutor for the Dachau trials. So that was one of his interviews at the Pentagon in early 1946. And then the other one was with Telford Taylor. And Telford Taylor was as I said, chief lieutenant. He was going to be taking over the prosecutions. There's a wonderful passage in the book where the two of them meet for the first time. Taylor is this tall, waspish New Englander, you know, very posh, very proper. Ferencz is this tiny, he was only like 5'1", maybe, 5 foot tall, you know, very sort of combative, wisecracking New Yorker. And the two of them just seemed like absolute opposites. And it was one of those cases of opposites attracted. They got along. Ferencz told the story many times, but one time during one of our phone calls where we were talking about it, something came out that I had never heard before. Ferencz spoke fluent French. And I'd never heard him say this, but when he was talking to me, it came out just spontaneously that Taylor tested him and started asking him questions in French. Ferencz answered beautifully, and they really bonded at that moment. And so this is a great passage in the book. But the bottom line is, Taylor says, come to Nuremberg. And Ferencz arrives in early 1946, and Taylor assigns him, according to Ben's standard account, assigns him right away to run the Berlin branch. Berlin is where all the Nazi documentation was located, and it became the most important investigative unit of all the investigative units that were preparing for the Nuremberg trials. And so this was a huge deal. Remember, this is 1946. Ferencz was born in 1920. He's only 26 years old. This is incredible. And while he's doing the investigations with his team, they come across a complete set of documents detailing the crimes of the Einsatzgruppen, those special units I was telling you about. And they are incredible, these documents. They tell anybody who looks at them right away that hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians were murdered by these units. Ferencz does some of the math. It comes to over 1 million, and he says, I've got to get down to Nuremberg. He hops on the first plane. He has this fateful meeting with Telford Taylor. He tells Taylor, we've got to have a trial. This is incredible. And Taylor says, we can't. We only have enough resources and enough prosecutors to do the trials that are already scheduled. And there were 11 trials that were going to be scheduled. Ferencz would not let up. He insisted that it had to be done. He talked about all these innocent victims who were murdered in cold blood. And Taylor finally buckled and said, okay, I'll authorize another trial if you can continue to do your work as chief of the Berlin branch and also be the chief prosecutor for this trial. And nothing was going to stop Ferencz from going forward. He said, I'll do both. And he worked around the clock. The guy was a tireless worker. And in fact, he became chief prosecutor for this trial. And he said that he knew he was the voice of the victims in the courtroom. And he conducted the prosecution that way. And it was clear from his first words in the trial, about which he later said, my opening statement was, it is with sorrow and with hope that we here disclose the deliberate murder of 1 million innocent people. I meant by that the sorrow was for the victims and the hope was that we could prevent it in the future. And the key charges were crimes against humanity and war crimes. Let me just say, and this is an important point as well that I will come back to, there were no crimes against peace charges. What we today refer to as aggression, which I referred to earlier, that was not in this case, all right? So, because one of my questions is, he's known for this crimes against humanity work. How did we get to aggression? So I'll talk about that. But given the success, by the way, the trials covered in chapters 12 and 13, and given the success of the Einsatzgruppen prosecution, Ferencz was elevated to the position of executive counsel of what is called the OCCWC, the Office of Chief Counsel for War Crimes Prosecution, and he is on his way to, obviously a shining career with the Nuremberg prosecution team. And what I want to talk about and do right now is give you a passage from the book that gives you a sense of what it was like to close the trial and to get the sentencing of these defendants. Now, I have to tell you something fascinating. The chief judge was a guy named Robert Mismano. You can see him right here. He's a guy from Pennsylvania. He wrote a lot of books. He wrote fiction, and he had a lot of law degrees and graduate degrees, and he was a very kind of ambitious guy. But one of the things he did in his very colorful career is he represented the famous defendants Sacco and Vanzetti. Have you all heard of Sacco and Vanzetti? They're two of the most famous defendants in American history. They were two Italian immigrants who were accused of murdering a clerk who was transferring money for a shoe company in Massachusetts. And they were anarchists, at least they were associated with anarchists, and many thought that they were wrongfully convicted. So this is one of the most celebrated cases, not celebrated, but infamous cases in American criminal history, and they were executed. And Mismano represented them. And Mismano became a lifelong opponent of the death penalty. You can imagine, though, that these Einsatzgruppen defendants who had murdered up to more than 1 million innocent civilians would be eligible for the death penalty. What was Mismano going to do? And there's a great passage in the book where he goes to a monastery. He's very devoutly Catholic. He goes to a monastery to pray and meditate, and then he's going to come back into the courtroom. And Ferencz is there, and this is the moment. So I'm going to share this passage with you. But the real drama was saved for the next day, April 10th, 1948, when the defendants would come to know their ultimate fates. Ferencz arrived early and sat in solitude, reflecting on all that had happened the past half year. He had come full circle, having been alone in the same space just before the trial opened, when so much burden had been placed on his young and slender shoulders. And now he realized he had survived the ordeal and was on the other end of a truly liminal experience. It had been a rite of passage. He had done all the hard work, negotiated each phase of the proceeding, answered all the challenges. It had transformed him. And now it was about to end. Like the strong autumnal afternoon light in late September, when he had sat there in seclusion and composed his opening statement on the eve of trial, the soft vernal morning light in early April shone through the great chamber as he awaited the trial's finish. The radiance of fall that he had perceived as hope was now the luminescence of spring that he knew was peace. Soon, courtroom 600 stirred to life. Ben's prosecution colleagues, the German Defense Council, the translators, the clerks, the guards, the reporters, and a throng of spectators in the visitors' galley streamed in. At 10 a.m., the marshal, Colonel Samuel L. Metcalf, called the case. Judges Bismano, Dixon, and Spate entered and took their places. From their perspective, surrounded by the sea of humanity, the two benches across the well of the courtroom stood out. The dock was entirely empty. Directly underneath it, in the bowels of the Palace of Justice, the defendants were gathered near the shaft of a lift that would, one by one, take them up 3 floors to learn whether they would live or die. Once all were seated and a calm had settled over the courtroom, Judge Mismano announced, "The marshal will produce the defendant, Otto Ohlendorf." Ingenious pre-war German engineering then stirred to life. The wheels, axles, and gears of the elevator machinery began to rumble within the belly of the massive edifice. The cage with its human cargo was now being hoisted up by the pulleys. As if by magic, the old burnished wood of the rear dock wall panel, an elevator door hidden in plain sight, slid open, and out stepped former SS General Otto Ohlendorf. Flanked by 2 African-American guards and military duds clutching white truncheons, he bowed respectfully, as had been his daily wont since the previous September, picked up the headphones, carefully fitted them over his ears, and then looked up expectantly at the judges, quote, with a clear, unafraid gaze. As was his daily wont since September, Mismano seized the bench's collective voice first. "Otto Ohlendorf," he began, "you have been found guilty on all counts which charge you with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations." And here he paused, later revealing his fleeting thought that, quote, 90,000 murdered souls were perhaps listening. Then he peered into Ohlendorf's impenetrable eyes and continued, "The court sentences you to death by hanging." On hearing this, as Adolf Eichmann would do 13 years later, Ohlendorf bowed his head, but he otherwise remained stoic, calmly removing the headphones and with the slightest enigmatic smile at the corner of his lips, returned to the lift with shoulders thrown back and head erect. Quote, "Then he slowly descended," Ferencz later wrote, "as if into hell." So this ends this incredibly important part of Ferencz's career. And he's contacted by something called the JRSO, the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization. He was known as being the prosecutor who had brought forth and been the chief lawyer involved with the most Holocaust-focused trial of the Nuremberg Trials, which was the Einsatzgruppen trial. And so they asked him to represent Holocaust survivors in terms of distributing heirless Jewish property found in US-occupied Germany. And this mandate included returning looted cultural, religious objects, even extending to Jewish cemeteries. And in the process, and in his tireless efforts to give Holocaust survivors chances to resume healthy and productive lives, Ferencz, once again, as with being a war crimes investigator, became a brilliant innovator in restitution practice, navigating conflicting claims and religious versus secular tensions with resourcefulness and great foresight. He relied on the largesse of U.S. Commissioner for Germany, High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, for a large part of the JRSO funding. Again, keep this in mind because McCloy is going to come back, all right? This is covered in chapter 15. His victim work evolved to cover compensation for damages suffered. That compensation, when combined with restitution, is called reparations. In September 1951, West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer acknowledged the need for Holocaust reparations, declaring that, quote, "unspeakable crimes have been committed in the name of the German people, calling for moral and material indemnity." In fact, that's the title for chapter 16, Moral and Material Indemnity. Soon, West Germany and Israel, joined by Jewish civil society under the name Claims Conference, began negotiating a treaty to provide such indemnity. Ferencz was a key Claims Conference advisor, negotiator, idea man, helping hammer out the 1952 Luxembourg Agreement between West Germany and Israel, as well as Hague Protocol number numbers 1 and 2 between West Germany and the Claims Conference, in other words, Jewish civil society. And pursuant to the latter, the United Restitution Organization, or URO, was established to file claims with Germany for Holocaust reparations. Ferencz became URO director, managing a large staff with operations around the world. And around this time, remember I mentioned to keep in mind John J. McCloy, around this time, via what was called the Peck Panel, and owing, I submit to you, to Cold War politics, McCloy commuted and or reduced the sentences of most of the Nuremberg convicts. Ferencz claimed that he did not try to intervene. Keep that in mind. But the bottom line is that by 1956, he felt ready to return to the United States. And in 1956, on returning to New York with his wife, Gertrude, and their 4 young children, Carrie, Robin, Don, and Nina, whom we see here, he continued to represent Holocaust victims as a private practitioner. Working with the Claims Conference, he sued several industrialists in West Germany for their use of Jewish slave labor during the war, including I.G. Farben and Krupp. And he later wrote a book about these cases, which you see here, called Less Than Slaves. It came out in 1979. He also represented B'nai B'rith in seeking compensation for Nazi-seized properties and filed claims on behalf of Good Samaritans. These are private citizens who provided free medical services to Holocaust survivors. This is covered in chapter 17, and this is only illustrative. He did a lot more incredible work for Holocaust survivors, and that's detailed in chapter 17. But with the war in Vietnam increasingly on his mind, right, the war in Vietnam taking place in the 1960s, Ferencz decided to phase out of reparations and concentrate on peace and prevention. He had helped past victims of atrocity. He wanted to work towards stopping future atrocities so that innocents would never have to be victims in the first place. And he was a major contributor. This we studied in my class. Any of you who are in my class today on aggression, he's the major contributor to that 1974 General Assembly resolution that we talked about today extensively, 3314, which defined aggression, and he was a huge contributor to the definition. He then embarked on a writing and teaching campaign that saw him establish the Pace Peace Center and publish various influential books about and advocating for the creation of a permanent international criminal court that could prosecute aggression. This is covered in chapter 18. During the 1990s, he advocated for a statute for a permanent international criminal court, which culminated in the 1998 conference in Rome, where he contributed toward terms and provisions taking care of victims, as my research revealed. Now, he mostly would talk about his contribution in Rome as being about aggression. He was able to help save the aggression provision because it was going to be negotiated out of the treaty, but they kept it in Article 5 of the treaty, of the Rome Statute, and then that's what was negotiated at Kampala when I met Ben Ferencz. So, but what he doesn't talk about, and what's incredible, is the impact that he had on the victim provisions. And in fact, this is revealed in the speech that he gave, very inspirational speech at the beginning of the conference. And I quote, "I have come to Rome to speak for those who cannot speak, the silent victims of monstrous deeds. Over 50 years ago, I stood in a courtroom at Nuremberg and accused 22 high-ranking German stormtroopers of deliberately murdering more than 1 million men, women, and children. I asked the tribunal to affirm the legal right of every human being to live in peace and dignity. It was a plea of humanity to law, a plea that needs repeating." Now, I want to point out to you that my research, you saw, remember my Nikon camera that you saw? That was at the annex to the U.S. Holocaust Museum, and a bunch of documents that had not yet been accessioned into the Ben Ferencz collection. In that, through careful searches, I was able to find a couple of amazing documents. One is from the head of the French delegation that was negotiating the victims provisions. His name is Gilbert Béti. Now, I asked Béti, did Ferencz work on victims provisions? You remember working with him? And he said, no, I don't. Ferencz told me that he had, that they had spoken about it. And I found this amazing document, which was a note indicating that he had been to Paris and had met with Béti at the Ministry of Justice. So this is one of my key archival finds that supports that, in fact, he was working with the French delegation in trying to give them ideas on how to craft the victims provisions. And then this, which I found, because during the lead up to Rome, there was a period called the PrepCom period, the preparatory commission period, where they were circulating drafts of the treaty that would ultimately become the Rome Statute. And this, at the time, was the provision on victims. And you could see that Ferencz was invested in this. He writes barely adequate. And then in the book, I talk about how he's going up and down and talking to delegates during the conference, and very important victim provisions are included. Afterwards, when the ICC statute is adopted, he continued to support the court, largely focusing on the crime of aggression, which was included, as I said, but not jurisdictionally situated or defined. He played that pivotal role in Kampala, where I met him in 2010, and that finally defined aggression pursuant to the definition that he was largely responsible for in UN General Assembly Resolution 3314. But he was disappointed with the politically driven jurisdictional limitations. And we see that now. He was a prophet in this regard, because we see that with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the very thing he worried about, there's nothing happening because Russia is a P5 member and can exercise its veto power. And so he actually had a great idea, which my class debated today at the end of class, which was to charge illegal use of force as a crime against humanity. And that's part of my PhD thesis, I'll point out to you guys. Now, you may recognize this person here. She's pretty famous. Last night, as part of our trivia contest, they were asking for the people who had the most Instagram followers. And I suspect Angelina Jolie is somewhere in the mix. But in August 2012, at the invitation of the chief prosecutor of the ICC at the time, Luis Moreno Ocampo, who is friends with Angelina Jolie, Ferencz joined the trial team and brought his historic perspective and moral authority to the court's first trial in the case against Thomas Lubanga. In his closing argument, the 91-year-old dean of international criminal law powerfully linked the crime of using child soldiers to the legal legacy of Nuremberg, a, quote, time machine moment. In fact, my chapter title is Time Machine Moments. You can see, go on YouTube and look. You can see the judges and you can see Moreno Ocampo, who's a pretty high-statured person, looking at him in awe. It's incredible. Here's this Nuremberg prosecutor who's making this closing argument, and his eloquent plea emphasized the gravity of the crimes, the imperative to protect victims, helping secure a conviction and a landmark reparations order for the children, beautifully closing the circle on his monumental career. Now, in his final years, he engaged in much international justice philanthropy, including funding the Benjamin B. Ferencz Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic. The clinic carries forward his work protecting the vulnerable, the work for victims. That was the proudest part of his legacy, as he told me. Okay, so that is his standard account. Now I want to tell you about my revelations. And I'm going to use the structure of the book to tell you what those revelations are. And I'm going to refer to something here as the missing link, because you've heard me talking about crimes against humanity and war crimes, as well as aggression. And I think that's a clue as to where I'm going with this. But let's see what we find. First, revelation number 1 in the probing section. Remember, Ferencz said he arrived in Nuremberg and he was immediately sent to Berlin to be chief of the Berlin branch? In fact, my research found that when he arrived in Nuremberg in the spring of 1946, Taylor assigned him to the investigative team of Industrialist Group Number 2, where he spent months investigating the executives of one of Hitler's key arm manufacturers, the Krupp firm, led by a guy named Alfred Krupp, as well as the executives of IG Farben, which manufactured products crucial for Hitler's war effort, as well, infamously, as the Zyklon B poison that was used in the gas chambers to kill millions of Jews. And both Krupp and IG Farben used slave labor consisting of Jews and citizens of other countries occupied by Nazi Germany. Ferencz's lines of inquiry led him to various parts of the German-speaking world, including Vienna, Linz, and Frankfurt. Related to this work, one of the key finds in my research was a letter Ferencz wrote to Gertrude, his wife, on May 24, 1946. I like to point out that this date is significant. in my biography, but it's also significant in my life because it happens to be my birthday. Now, I'm not saying I was born in 1946, but I thought it was pretty cool that this is one of the most important archival finds I made. And in this letter, he says, you know, we are now busy trying to prove that I.G. Farben and Krupp and their officials should be hung as warmongers and murderers. It is very interesting going into the details of the organization and finding out how efficiently these sinister forces operated. I'm sure we'll be able to prove that they desired and planned for war and that they headed the looting of foreign industries, as well as used concentration camp inmates for their experiments on poison gases, etc. And these are the distinguished white-collar gentlemen of finance. I feel a certain satisfaction in the work, as though we are groping for the roots of war causes, and perhaps we may move a little closer thereby toward permanent peace. This is one of the most significant documents I found. No other researcher had come across this, and it shows what his mindset was. Revelation number 2 in the prosecuting section. Ferencz only ever discussed being a podium prosecutor for Einsatzgruppen. This was amazing. In fact, he was a podium prosecutor for the Krupp trial. Einsatzgruppen was number 9. This was number 10. He never talked about this, ever. From the book, this is directly from the book, which if you read it, you'll hear my voice in this. But having spent the better part of 3 days speaking with Ben Ferencz in great detail about his career, one of the most dramatic moments in my research for this book was coming across a document in the Telford Taylor papers at Columbia University. It was a press release that indicated Ferencz was cross-examining witnesses in the Krupp trial. I could not believe my eyes. In great excitement, I zipped out of the Butler Library's rare book and manuscript section and onto the grounds of the main campus, where I made cell phone calls in the frozen winter air to fellow Nuremberg experts, including Ben's son, Don. They had similarly been ignorant of Ferencz's Krupp trial exploits and were equally astonished. This was incredible. I couldn't believe my eyes. And this, I know I need to be brief because I'm running out of time, but this is an example of where I was about to give up. I was going through all these files. I was looking at documents, document after document. I thought, what am I doing here? This guy's told his story for years. I spent days with him hearing his story. What am I going to find here? And then I was about to give up, and I came across this document, which turned out to be the most important, even more than the May 24th document I just shared with you. So this is incredible. And what I want to do now is give you a passage from the book of him cross-examining a witness during the Krupp trial. Now, he only ever talked about his opening statement in Einsatzgruppen. It turns out he was an incredible trial lawyer. And you're going to see that, I think, from this passage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share what I have here, and then when the transcript comes up, I'm going to put it up so you can see what the transcript is. When I say still feeling a sense of righteous indignation, this is when he was cross-examining the witness I found in the press release. Still feeling that sense of righteous indignation, 4 days later, Ferencz cross-examined Carolina Goylin, one of the SS guards at the Rolling 2 facility. On direct examination, Goylin testified that she had worked for Krupp as a, quote, supervisor of the Hungarian Jewesses who lived in the adjoining Humboldtstrasse camp. Goylin maintained that the women were treated well with good living facilities, adequate food and clothing, and not subject to any injurious or degrading treatment. Ferencz began his cross-examination by stressing Goylin's ties to the SS, her training at Ravensbrück concentration camp, and a resulting incarceration in Ludwigsburg internment camp as a suspected war criminal. The cross-examination began quite strongly, the witness's credibility immediately being called into question, with Ferencz exerting excellent control. Here we go. Miss Goylin, how long were you interned in Ludwigsburg internment camp? Goylin, let me think, about 6 months. Why? Because we were supervisors. Because you were a Krupp supervisor and member of the SS? Yes, SS. You were employed by the Krupp firm in Rolling Mill 2 from 7 March? Yes. Until August 1944, is that correct? Yes. And at the time, the Krupp chief of Rolling Mill 2, Mr. Hammerschmidt, told you, yes. Just a moment, witness. Just wait until I put my question before you answer it. Now I'm asking you if the Krupp chief of Rolling Mill 2 told you that he was gathering Krupp employees to serve as SS guards for Krupp laborers. Is that correct? Yes. And then he sent you with some other Krupp employees to Ravensbrück concentration camp for training. Is that correct? Yes. Ferencz then concentrated on Goylan's training at Ravensbrück. Through superior interrogation technique and timing, he made her evasive and incomplete responses seem comical, and through detail stacking and repetition, tied them to her Ravensbrück training. What kind of training did you get at the Ravensbrück concentration camp to enable you? Just a moment, witness. Just let me finish my question. I am asking you what kind of training you got from this concentration camp to enable you to perform your work as a Krupp guard. How am I to understand this question? Were you there for, say, 2 weeks? Yes. What kind of training did you get? We were only told that we were not to beat the women. So for 2 weeks, every day, 8 hours a day, they told you not to beat the women. No. Did it take them 2 weeks, 8 hours a day in order to teach you not to beat women? 2 weeks. I was only there for not quite 2 weeks. And after the 2 weeks, Krupp requested your return from Ravensbrück. Is that correct? Yes. Having unsettled the witness about her affiliation with the SS, her training at Ravensbrück, and her incarceration during the Allied occupation, Ferencz garnered a crack regarding the living conditions of the Hungarian Jewish women during the period of Krupp enslavement. Then, when the witness tried to lie, Ferencz pounced, expertly using her affidavit to impeach her. Now, you saw these girls in the Humboldtstrasse camp, did you not? Yes. Do you remember that the sanitary facilities were so inadequate that the girls had to relieve themselves in the open? Not at the beginning, toward the end, that is correct. And isn't it true they had no opportunity to wash themselves in the camp? Yes, at the beginning they had opportunities to wash, but later they had none. No, later they no longer had them. Do you remember that they were allowed to wash themselves in the showers of the factory, don't you? Yes. And those who didn't leave the showers in time were beaten, weren't they? I don't know anything about that. Did you suddenly forget? No. Do you remember a sworn statement that you gave to Mr. Kostler? Yes. And do you remember that at the time you swore that those girls who didn't leave the shower quickly were beaten? Yes, they were beaten. So they actually were beaten, weren't they? Yes. Now, you remember that these girls had to live in the cellar in Humboldtstrasse? Yes. And it was so cold there and so damp that the beds on which these girls had to sleep were frozen, weren't they? Yes. And for a long time, they had only to sleep on wooden boards. Isn't that correct? I don't know whether they had to sleep on wooden boards. I think they had iron beds. Until this point, via each segment of the cross, Ferencz had been drawing out progressively darker details regarding the Krupp slave labor experience. And so, having boxed Goylan in by demonstrating that he could effectively impeach her if she lied, he appropriately finished by eliciting the most damning testimony. Do you remember that the camp commander, Oskar Rieck, carried a rubber hose? Yes. And do you also remember that he carried a long leather whip? Yes. And do you remember that Rieck was particularly brutal to these Jewish girls? Yes. And he ill-treated them in an inhumane manner? Yes. In sum, Ferencz destroyed Goylan as a defense witness and actually turned her into a prosecution asset. The superb quality of this cross-examination is evident. The questions were appropriately leading and laconic. The use of outside evidence for impeachment was handled with aplomb. The indirect manner of making the witness's lies seem foolish, even humorous, was devastatingly effective. The overall pacing and buildup was perfect. Overall, then, the command over the witness was complete and impressive, with Ben even showing he was aware that the colloquy was being recorded, such that he consistently instructed the witness not to speak over him. This may seem remarkable, given that it was only Ferencz's second trial, but that is a misleading statistic. So, he is an incredible trial advocate, and we never knew about this. Number three, revelation number three, providing the slave labor litigation. His Krupp work helps contextualize his prominent post-Nuremberg role in directing the Claims Conference Nazi slave labor civil litigation program, which included a case against Krupp. During the 1950s and 60s, this was a main part of his work. And in a June 9th, 1958 letter to Saul Kagan, who was Ferencz's JRSO deputy, Ben noted that in seeking justice via civil litigation for the crimes of Krupp and other Nazi corporate exploiters, quote, it would give me a great deal of personal satisfaction to meet the challenge and reach a settlement for slave laborers. A follow-up letter to former Nuremberg prosecutor Drexel Sprecher underscored his desire to seek belated justice vis-a-vis Krupp. Quote, I am going for a gentleman by the name of Krupp. The plan simply is to start one or more cases in a German court, seeking to hold Krupp and the firm liable for personal injuries, pain, and suffering or other damages inflicted upon concentration camp inmates laboring for them. This endeavor is designed to be the key, opening the way to an overall settlement on behalf of all similarly situated concentration camp inmates. For this purpose, I will require as a starting point our old Nuremberg documents. In light of this, remarkably, Ferencz never even mentioned his Nuremberg work related to the Krupp case in Less Than Slaves, his 1979 memoir, which in great detail explained the slave labor litigation campaign. Revelation number 4, preventing. Most importantly, Ferencz's work on the industrialist cases arguably helps explain, in part, his later passionate crusade to define, criminalize, and prevent aggression. He was well aware that a coterie of key German magnates, the likes of Alfred Krupp, whom I've mentioned, Friedrich Flick, whom you see in this photo, and the directors of IG Farben had enabled Hitler's military conquests. Once again, we've just seen that in May 1946, while investigating the industrialist cases in Nuremberg, he expressed to his wife that, quote, IG Farben and Krupp and their officials should be hung as warmongers. He elaborated, I'm sure we'll be able to prove that they desired and planned for war. And then he concluded portentously, I feel a certain satisfaction in the work as though we are groping for the roots of war causes, and perhaps we may move a little closer thereby toward permanent peace. Revelation number 4 continued. But much to Ferencz's dismay, the munitions masters tried at Nuremberg were acquitted of every single count of crimes against peace. And it was the end of his civil litigation work against the industrialists, which realized very disappointing results. Telford Taylor referred to them in the foreword to the book as a meager harvest. And thus, he was likely contemplating the justice deficits in reference to monsters such as Krupp and Flick when he decided to phase out of his Holocaust reparations work and devote himself fully to the cause of peace and, by extension, atrocity prevention. So we might consider Ben's powerful May 1946 communication to his wife as the missing link. That's the missing link I've been talking about, explaining the connection between his aggression-related work on the industrialist cases at Nuremberg and his ultimate transformation into a peace advocate. I never understood the connection between his work on Einsatzgruppen, which was war crimes and crimes against humanity focused, and his later crusade against aggression. This missing link provided that. So this is a very powerful research find, and it fills the gap in the historical record. I want to conclude with some other revelations that aren't related to the missing link, but that are also incredibly powerful. My research revealed first that Ferencz's transfer, remember I mentioned his transfer and the fact that he said that his former law professor at Harvard had been responsible for him transferring? I found in the archival record that in fact, his own application to the judge advocate section is what got him in. So it wasn't that he was plucked out of obscurity to start this war crimes investigation unit. He, in fact, facilitated his transfer. Second, his monument, and by the way, and then earned, and on the merits, earned his, if you will, progression into a leader in that unit. His Monuments Men work related to Nazi art plundering yielded serious results and helped contribute to the prosecution of Hitler's second-in-command, Hermann Goering, at the first Nuremberg trial. Again, Ferencz treated this comically in his memoirs. And then there's the importance of the great philosopher Hannah Arendt in Ferencz's restitution work. Arendt worked for Jewish Cultural Restitution, or JCR, which was under the aegis of Ferencz's JRSO. Their personal relationship, I say here, was poor. It was horrible. Ferencz found her to be arrogant and believed that she accomplished little. It was his theory that she was there as a boondoggle to have an affair with her former lover, Martin Heidegger, who was a disgraced Nazi philosopher. I did research on this. You'll see it in my book, and I think I've debunked that. But it did not take away from the animosity that Ferencz felt toward her. I was also able to show that she actually did instrumental work in recovering vast amounts of looted Jewish property. My research also revealed that Ferencz played a role in successfully advocating against some of John McCloy's contemplated clemency commutation decisions in reference to Nazi war criminals. Despite him saying that he never had anything to do with that, I found an amazing document in the archives of a recording that was transcribed between McCloy and Ferencz at the Harvard Club, where McCloy is telling Ferencz, you know, if it weren't for you, I probably would have commuted all the sentences, but you convinced me that some of the worst people that I decided needed to be executed were executed. This is an incredible find, and I think Ferencz wanted to avoid being seen as having a conflict of interest. So he didn't want the restitution work to be confused with the commutation stuff, but it's there. And then he was in communication with the Israeli Attorney General regarding how the case against Adolf Eichmann should be prosecuted, and communicated with Israeli prosecutors about the case and the key role of victims when spending time in Israel doing Holocaust reparations work. Prosecutors, you may know, if you know anything about the Eichmann trial, made victim testimony a central part of the trial. That had not been true at Nuremberg. And we don't know exactly what Ferencz's role was in this regard. I had wanted to speak with Gabriel Bach, who was the last surviving prosecutor on the Eichmann prosecution team, and sadly he died before I was able to talk to him. But Ferencz was very clear that he spent a lot of time in Israel and spent a lot of time speaking with them. And he wasn't able to be there during the trial because of his other obligations, but it would seem that not only did he persuade, I think, the prosecutors to make victims prominent, but this trial changed his life. Just as Eichmann put Holocaust victims and survivors front and center, Ferencz realized that when he had come back to New York, he just wanted to be a regular New York attorney. With the Eichmann trial, he realized that he wanted to continue to do Holocaust survivor work, and that became his focus. So this is a very important part of his life that my research revealed. So my concluding thoughts. Why did Ferencz leave out so many prominent details from his life story, which he began recounting more and more as he became more prominent in his later life? His transfer to Patton's JA section, his initial work in Nuremberg on the industrialist cases before being transferred to Berlin, the importance of his work on, my moderator is leaving during my most important, probably important point, his work on the Goering art plundering case, his intervention with McCloy regarding commutation of sentences, his work with Hannah Arendt, and his contributions on the margins to the Eichmann trial. Perhaps those parts of his biography may simply have receded in his memory over time. But Ferencz, excluding his work on the industrialist cases and telling his life story, cannot be chalked up to memory lapse alone. In interviewing him, because the minute I came across that press release in the Telford Taylor archives, I took the first plane down to Florida and I confronted him and said, how is it that you never talk about your work on the Krupp case? And he remembered. It was evident to me that he remembered it. And he told me even that he deliberately omitted it from his life story because he did not think that it was important. However, we have seen that his work on the Krupp case was so important in his life story. It explains in large part why he was chosen to head the Berlin branch, which in turn set him up to be selected as executive counsel. It was when he was at the peak of his trial advocacy skills, which we saw when looking at that trial transcript. His work on the case helped inspire his litigation crusade against Nazi slave laborers during the 1950s and 60s. Its crimes against humanity, against peace acquittals, and meager settlement outcomes arguably fired his passion for seeking the criminalization of aggression. So why did he consciously exclude it in telling his life story? I think the answer is simple. A perception, even if subconscious, that involvement with the Krupp Nuremberg proceeding might muddy his Nuremberg legacy. The more streamlined narrative he honed over the years was cleaner and much more powerful. He arrived in Nuremberg and was immediately, and impressively for his young age, put in charge of the OCC-WC's new investigative nerve center in Berlin. While there, he found the evidence that allowed for the Einsatzgruppen trial, fought for the proceeding to take place, and then served as its chief prosecutor. It was arguably Nuremberg's most black and white, good versus evil case, for which more death sentences were issued than any other trial, and only one of 3 NMT proceedings pursuant to which defendants were executed. Compare this to the Krupp trial's legacy. All of the defendants in that proceeding were acquitted of crimes against peace, and even those convicted of crimes against humanity for slave labor, spoliation, received relatively light sentences. And they were soon released thanks to McCloy's absurd clemency commutation decisions. Even worse, Alfred Krupp regained all his wealth and via resuming the old family business, soon became one of Europe's wealthiest men. Perhaps in the end, Ferencz asked himself, again, even if only subconsciously, why be associated with such tainted justice? Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, so we've lost our chair. So oh, you're back. Okay.
He's back.
So I have a few comments.
Not on the book. Jesus. Finally got my book, and it's going to have this big imprint on it now.
And where's the other book which is traveling? Will it come back?
That's back there. It doesn't have the beautiful jacket on.
So I can answer two of the questions you posed. 1963, and of course Jennifer Aniston is 300. Not Jennifer.
Yeah, that's right.
She's what's her face? Angelina Jolie is 333 on it.
Is that what it right?
Yes,
Okay.
And 1963, you can figure it on your own. And so I just want to say a couple of things. It's always a really great honor to talk about a colleague's book because what you see is, you know, the promulgation of several years of work. And I think this is really, really an excellent and interesting book, and it pains me to say that.
Yeah.
But I'm going to say some of the things I really like about it, and some of the things that I think are unknown that have come up. So I was going to comment a fair bit about Krupp, and I think Krupp is important here because it does show a tendency in Ferencz that I think you may, and perhaps a tendency in us all that I think you identified, which is Ferencz's really inability to tell a consistent story about his life. And he does this with respect to Krupp. There's also the passages which you don't talk about his infidelity in his marriage, his relationship with his children, which are contained in the book in some ways quite interesting and quite unknown. So everyone of my generation who's come up in international criminal law and international law generally knows Ferencz, right? So I met him a number of times. I've met his son, who would appropriately trot him out at public international law events. 5'1" is generous, but I knew him later in life. And so he would always talk about the one trial, right? That was what he spoke about. And he didn't speak about the other events in the same way, which is what makes the book quite interesting. Now, why he doesn't talk about Krupp, I think he doesn't talk about Krupp for the same reason you dislike Krupp in your book, which is you criticize one of the decisions at 311 of your book. I don't think I share that view, right? I think it's actually I think the decision's correct. I think what you're criticizing is the law of corporate responsibility. So it would have been interesting to elaborate on that, and I hope in your future writings that's what you're going to do.
I've been an amicus for the U.S. Supreme Court on this issue of corporate liability with respect to mens rea. So I definitely have a view on this.
Right, and so I think that's helpful, right? I mean, of course, when you're trying to write a biography, right, you can't really get into all these interesting legal questions, but that's one of them, I sort of wish you'd explored, and I'm glad to see you have explored it elsewhere. The other things that were sort of lesser known and really quite interesting was Ben Ferencz's work on art restoration. He never really spoke about that. I mean, that could have also just been the situations in which I met him and came to know him. His son's work as part of the organization on human rights generally. His opposition to the Vietnam War is very unknown, and his criticism of the Iraqi trials is quite interesting, particularly in light of his somewhat complicated relationship with other people, including Michael Scharf, who was formerly the dean of Case Western Law School, treats himself as one of the most important people writing in international criminal law.
Yeah, in
and
a big way.
Perhaps most importantly for our students, organizes the ICC moot.
Yeah.
But also advise the judges on how to prosecute Saddam Hussein. So I would have been quite interested to hear if you were willing to discuss that in greater length. I have my own views about the trial of Saddam Hussein, which are to suggest that I think your diagnosis is one of sort of profound injustice is correct, whatever we think of his own personal liability. And then there's one other point I wanted to make, because I am trying to do this very as quickly as I possibly can so we can get to questions. The sort of broader question about procedural injustice in Nuremberg that you bring up. So there's several places in the book that you don't mention. I understand, right, that when you're giving a book presentation about a complex and important historical person, there's a fine line between being fair to the book and being fair to the person, but not engaging in hagiography.
Yeah.
And so there's several places where, on my view, evidence should have been thrown out, right? There was the interrogation you talk about where Ben Ferencz basically threatened someone with a gun, brings someone in to threaten him.
Yeah.
There is the open obstruction of justice by not providing the protocol. This is page 250 in the book, if anyone has it, to prosecutors. And I think these are really interesting things because, look, it's difficult to stand up there and say that you're sympathetic to Nazis. But if you care about due process, there's a lot of places in your book where you have suggested, and I hope you'll write about this, that what Ben Ferencz did was probably in violation of US law, right? If he'd been a US lawyer, he probably would have been sanctioned, right? Certainly acting in the US.
I mean, I make a lot out of this in the book in the sense that he's a very contradictory figure. He's a very complex figure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so for those of you who don't know, at one point one of the prosecutors keeps evidence about an important protocol from one of the trials. This is 250 of the book if you have it. And at one point, one prosecutor threatens to kill another prosecutor. And really quite an amusing.
Yeah, it's in
quite an
chapter
amusing
14.
passage, right?
Yes, chapter
So
14.
maybe I'll just conclude on that point. Understanding it's important for ministries, Van Eckert had shared the document with Chief Prosecutor Robert Kempner, but as justice was being tried during the course of 1947, Von Eckert became aware of the prosecution's failure to rely on the protocol, which seems strange, as Justice Ministry officials had been present at the Wannsee Conference and the protocol had implications for the administration of justice. Von Eckert asked Justice Chief Prosecutor La Follette, a former US Congressman, about the omission. The feisty La Follette was at the first time, was incredulous, claiming he hadn't heard about it, and once he realized that Kempner, a glory hound known for hoarding important investigative finds only to later claim credit for them in the process, had concealed the protocol. La Follette asked Kempner for the document. He feigned ignorance. La Follette exploded. The executive council was then called in as the Justice Chief Prosecutor was seriously threatening to kill the minister's chief prosecutor. First, I called Taylor and I said, "Telford, I got a problem. Charlie wants to kill Bob Kempner." Right? And that's that last bit is a quote. And so the fact that really a substantial number of these documents seems to have been hidden, which is not something that's well documented elsewhere in the literature, I think is an otherwise really important find. So let me then just conclude by saying thank you for having me and congratulations on your book yet again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
I told you I did.
Yeah. That's great.
I loved exactly all those parts which were criticized, because for me this book is great literature. I'm not from this corner of the law at all. I'm a public lawyer, but then encountering this kind of work is something that made me feel like facing something truly special. Already the first book of this biography, I think, is one of the first page of this biography, one of the best first pages I have read, and I read biography all the time, because it gives you a very concise summary of all what is cool about the book. You already realize it will be a page turner, and at the same time, it also shows that the guy is profoundly flawed. Yes, he's really a terrible guy. He threatens people with guns. He violates the law, and yet he's a hero. And we owe him a super important branch of international law in many respects. So in this sense, this book is really something that you want to have, even if you're not a lawyer, and even if you're not particularly interested in this particular corner of the law. So I'm truly honored to be able to say a couple of words about the book, and this is my first observation. So if you want really a story that is not a one-way street in kind of glorified, but it's not a hagiography. I agree. You want aircrafts falling down. You want someone being thrown out from a military plane with his wife landing in different sectors of Berlin. You want someone's requisitioned car almost falling off a cliff on the way to Gotthard Tunnel in winter. How silly to travel in winter across those mountains like that. And then plenty of other things. Forgery. How does he become so great? At least if I trust your research, and I think I can. How does he get this cute Jeep? He simply forges a letter from General Patton. He invents a seal. I don't know how he does exactly. He asks some random officer to sign, and then he's a nobody in the military. So this book is a story about how absurd U.S. military is. US military doesn't work. And
true.
precisely because
Yeah.
of the humiliating absurdity and short-sightedness of the US military,
Yeah.
we have this hero who can emerge as a great presence in the world of the law. So the guy registered, he's a private, then he becomes a corporal. He doesn't like promotions because, I mean, he wanted to be an officer. He wanted to not to care so much about all this military things. He registers as a driver of this jeep. So in all the documents, he's a driver. He's shuttling some officer around, but in fact, he is the investigator. He is the mind, not the one who is behind. I don't know whether you see behind in those things. So in fact, all the hierarchies are broken, and this is something that deeply appeals to me, and this is something in which I sense Transylvania,
Yeah.
precisely where that family is starting from. And then there is a lot of beautiful exaggeration. Who was Mr. Ferencz? And the answer from Professor Gordon is he was a humble Jewish immigrant, a son of a miserable one-eyed janitor. And it's true. So this one-eyed janitor in a slum in New York, responsible for two houses for the one of the poorest settlements, right?
Tenements. They're tenement houses. Yeah.
So this is where he started. And then this guy, when he's graduating from Harvard, when he has all this valuable experience, he writes to the army. Thank you, army. I can be useful probably. Take me. And they reply, unfortunately, your father did, and because he was naturalizing by the father. He was brought to the U.S. at the age of 2 months, I think, or 3 months, very, very early. Not enough. So your father naturalized only recently, and you need to be a U.S. citizen for 15 years in order to enter this officer's school. So then this guy with valuable experience for precisely conducting these trials, who has unique knowledge, having served this magnificent professor at Harvard, he's starting as a typist in this artillery unit. And then there is a lot of humor in the book. He has never learned to type, and he has never learned to fire a gun. So all the army training was total garbage, and it didn't help him at all. And then he only emerged as someone great precisely because he ignored all the directives. And then when he's already in charge of the Berlin office, they give him a Maybach with a driver. What does he do with a Maybach? He goes partying with his wife and with some friends in a different sector of Berlin. Is it prohibited by regulations? Of course. What happens with the Maybach? Unfortunately, it's stolen. They say he suspected the Russians, so he was walking around the Russian sector looking for the Maybach everywhere. He didn't find it. They open a case against him. Of course, it's a crime to lose a very, very expensive car, a kind of Rolls Royce in those times. And then the investigator from the military investigating the case, what he has done with the Maybach while he's partying, brings the whole file to this guy, Mr. Ferencz, and Mr. Ferencz tells him, Lieutenant, leave the file with me. I will study it carefully and I will reply in writing. Fine, the lieutenant is gone and the file is binned. And when there is no file, there is no prosecution. So forget the Maybach and the guy is really great. But then all these fun things aside, I think what the book teaches us, and from the general point of studying the law, is that unfortunately, if we look at Einsatzgruppen, if we look at other trials, the didactical power of the law is nihil. Because one of the most powerful moments in the book is where Ferencz goes down to the cellar where Ollendorf, who has just been convicted to death for murdering hundreds of thousands of people, is kept, and he asks Ollendorf whether he could be of any assistance. He hopes to see repentance, at least a slight sparkle of it, and he sees none of it. So he only gets propaganda back, and he leaves. And why does he go there? If we believe Gregory Gordon, because Ollendorf, a super senior murderer, was actually very professional in what he was doing. So why was he professional? He was not allowing his subordinates, for instance, to crash the baby skulls against the trees in the forest, and insisted that they would not be used for target practice. Or he was allowing Jewish mothers to hold their children while they're shot, rather than throwing them separately into the ditch. That's the professionalism we're talking about. And the law has not changed anything in the way how that guy perceives his acts. So it was probably good for those who suffered in the hands of those guys. But those guys, they didn't change as a result of this legal experience. And the last thing I wanted to say, I think it's very important to confront the banality of evil. And the book is about the banality of evil. All those guys are professionals. If you look at those who are tried in the Einsatzgruppen trial, before they donned those beautiful SS uniforms, and the boss who produced them is still, you can buy their garments at every airport. Those guys are architects, those guys are mayors of small towns, those guys are school teachers. So they're ordinary guys. They have ordinary careers like any one of us. And it's really a disastrously clear presentation of how horrible evil is. And I think art is an even more powerful of confronting this kind of guys than law. I cannot believe I'm saying this as a lawyer, but law failed in treating those guys. So then if we think about art, and if this book joins literature, not only the writing, then I think we have a different kind of hope and a different kind of angle of looking at this kind of produce. And here I think I will use the moment a little bit, and knowing Gregory's love for poetry, I found an amazing, it's a super famous poem that goes exactly about what Einsatzgruppen trial started with. The most famous massacre, Babi Yar, and how do you internalize, engage with it through law? You don't. You can try, but you don't. And through art you can. So when Yevtushenko wrote the poem, which has the same name, he was also 27, exactly the age when Ferencz rises to the occasion. And I will read just a small part. And the small part is like this. Leaves are forbidden, so is sky, but much is still allowed, very gently, in darkened rooms, each other to embrace. They come. No, fear not. Those are sounds of spring itself. She is coming soon. They break the door. No, river ice is breaking. Wild grasses rustle over Babi Yar. The trees look sternly, as if passing judgment. Here silently, all screams, and hat in hand, I feel my head changing shape to gray. When Shostakovich read this poem, he immediately set it to music, and he wept when he showed the music to the author. So if we have 2 more minutes, I can play a small excerpt from the Babi Yar Symphony. And these are exactly the words.
Welcome to the world of art.
Wow, that was extraordinary. I've done a lot of these presentations, and that was incredibly powerful. Thank you so much. And I think understanding some of the things that I wanted to say in the book in that medium expresses it so powerfully. So I'm grateful. Thank you. Thank you for the great comments. And Kevin, thank you as well. I guess I've got nothing else. I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has. I'm glad that we got these incredible insights from our two commentators, but I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might have. Yeah. Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, so where were the archives and how did you find them?
Great question. So there were different archives. That letter, for example, to his wife, the May 24, 1946 letter, was held privately by his daughter, and his daughter gave me access to those. So nobody else had seen these. She actually just went to Washington, D.C. I was actually invited to, Ben Ferencz was just awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, and I was invited to the ceremony, but because of my teaching obligations here and other things, I couldn't go. But Carrie, his daughter who lives in California, took those letters to Washington, D.C., and those will be incorporated into the U.S. Holocaust Museum's collection. But I had an incredible opportunity to get access to them. The other archives include, everything from other former prosecutors who had their own personal archives, apart from Taylor's archives, of course, McCloy's archives, and Ferencz's own, diaries and things that were already part of the collection.
What collections?
It's at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Yeah, that was the collection. Where you saw my Nikon camera, those were in the annex of documents that had not been accessioned. And so I went through those, and again, other researchers I don't think had access to those. So I was really lucky to get this, kind of even Sheldon Gluck's archives were helpful. So this kind of access was really such an important part of the project. Yeah, great question. Any other questions? Yeah, Dimitry.
How would you assess his legacy given the standing of ICC today?
To me, the standing of the ICC today is not the important reference point. To me, it's what's going to happen in the longer arc of history. I think that his legacy will end up becoming incredibly important because while we're in a dark moment now, and while the ICC, which is still relatively young, remember, it only started operating in 2002, that it has a long history ahead of it. There will be ups and downs. It's incredible to think of a legal institution as well as a body of law at its very beginning. One of the reasons I love teaching this stuff is because what other part of the law do you know where you can go to the very beginning, the ground floor, and see how it's developed just in a matter of a few decades and explore that with students? We have many, many decades, but also many centuries and probably millennia to go for this incredible development that has happened during his life and that I've devoted my career to furthering for that to come to fruition. To me, that's the reference point. But I appreciate that we're living through a tough time right now. Yeah, that's a great question. Any other questions? My wife has been with me, I think, for every presentation. She's heard every question. One we get sometimes is about the death penalty, because he ultimately was against it, but you could see that in his letter to his wife in May 1946, he seems to embrace it. And then if you read the book, when the death sentences are announced, he's absolutely devastated, because he never really thought through what it would be like to have his work lead to these people being sentenced to death. And I think that's part of the reason that he went to see Ohlendorf too, as well. But it was really powerful to see how his views on this evolved over time. So yeah, it's I think if you read, and I think as Kevin pointed out, it's funny because, Kevin said, I wouldn't speak for an hour. Because he said, how long are you going to speak? I said an hour. Shouldn't. He said shouldn't. Okay, so he's a law.
I believe you will.
He's a law professor, so he was being normative. But then, ironically, afterwards said there were so many things you didn't include, which just gives you a sense of what a challenge it is to take a book like this and go through all the relevant points. You can't do it in an hour. I mean, the fact that I had an hour is incredible. But the point is, I think if you read it, you're going to find a lot of things that I couldn't cover, including the stuff about his personal life, which I think make him, as Professor Kochenov said, a very complex, very interesting character. I deal with that right at the outset. You'll see that I acknowledge that he is definitely a complex character, and this is definitely not a hagiography. In fact, to be honest with you, some of the personal revelations that I came upon through my research, which I wasn't looking for, have actually caused a rift between me and his son. So his son was not happy that some of this stuff was discovered. I didn't go looking for it, but I wasn't going to suppress it. And in my postscript, of course it had to be with a P, the last part of the book had to be a P for my alliteration. The postscript talks about the dilemma I faced and ultimately how I decided to go forward with the revelations. So it's a rich book, I think, for that. A lot of law professors write a lot of books about law and doctrine and maybe policy. To be able to write about that within the context of this incredible life, and to be able to, I love to write. And so to be able to write something that was not so limited in scope and that allowed me to write more, I don't know, how should I put it, broadly, in different ways that I normally don't as a law professor, was an incredible thing for me to be able to do. So I'm really glad that I could share it with you all today. I'm humbled that so many of you came today and gave your attention, and I hope you get a chance to read it. And if you do, I'm here and would always love to discuss any of it with you. So, we have another question. He did. Yeah.
Do you think that he would mostly agree, or how would you feel about this portrayal of his legacy? Because the difference between what he kept on talking about,
Yeah.
the version of it, right? Do you think he would be complacent about it? Do you think he would be?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, his son was mentioned was not very happy about it.
Yeah.
It's a very complex life, so.
Yeah. The truth is, I don't know. I mean, that's the most honest answer. I think he would have appreciated a lot. I guess the way the book works, if you read it, is that there are a lot of things that he didn't say that I think show him in a great light that he should have gotten more credit for. And again, within the span of an hour, there's only so much I can cover. But things like the whole idea for the resuscitation of the International Criminal Court Project was something that was kind of his brainchild, and Ann R. Robinson, who was the president of Trinidad and Tobago, and who brought up the idea of resuscitating the International Criminal Court Project with the General Assembly in 1989. Ferencz wrote his speech that he gave to the General Assembly. He never takes credit for that. There were so many things like that that he did that he never took credit for. By the same token, there were certain things that he took credit for in a way that were probably exaggerations, like saying that he was the one who was selected to set up this war crimes unit and it was all about him. No, he applied for it, and by dint of hard work, he rose up and he became a leader. But you know, his entire experience at the beaches of Normandy, people would have the impression that he landed on D-Day, and he would never disabuse them of that. He would just sort of go along with it, but in fact, he was there at D plus, I don't know, 27. I can't remember the exact. It was 4th of July, actually. You can do the math. June 6th to 4th of July, 27, 28 days. So there were times when he did that, and then I think there were a lot of interesting parts of his life that we'll never really know why he didn't talk about them. At the end of my presentation, I talked about my own theories, but I'll never know for sure. And that's what I think is so fascinating. If you think of, you know, the Mona Lisa, you know, one of the most famous paintings in history, if we're going to bring it back to art, and we never really know what her smile is about. There's something about Ferencz and his life and the way he led it that is a bit like Mona Lisa's smile. We'll never really know. And I don't even know that he knew 100%. But reading about it, well, first of all, having researched it and having spent so much time with him, and then writing it all up was an incredible experience, one that I can't imagine not having in my career. And so I'm glad I got to do it. But, yeah, thank you.
Sorry, another follow-up.
Yeah.
But then with that being said, if you have more time with them, is there a section particularly just on top of your head, or if that's something that you've been contemplating about as well, that if you have more time?
If I'd add more time, yeah.
You really want to drill him down and dig deeper about him too. That would be good.
I mean, I think I would have probably, you know, one of the areas I would have probably tried to dig deeper on the art investigations, on the looting and the art. I never completely understood, and he may not have told me. There were many times, you know, I would say, because I understood that what would make this book powerful was the detail. You know, when I gave you the passage when they were about to hear the sentences, and I've got the name of the marshal who called the case, the way he called the case. If you look at my description of the courtroom on the day the Einsatzgruppen trial started, I've got every aspect of the courtroom described. It's that moment, it's living in that moment. Here's somebody who would only talk about, you know, the words of his opening statement. And he didn't want to go into a lot of detail. I would ask him about some of these details, and he'd say, you know, what are you bothering me with that for? You know, he would give me a hard time, and you know, who cares? And I would say, Ben, you know, this stuff matters. It really matters. So I think even if I had been able to talk to him about certain other things, I think he might have been reluctant, and he was, I don't know, he was a very guarded person in certain ways, but then also very expansive when he wanted to talk about the things that he wanted to talk about. So I don't know. I would have loved to spend more time with him, and I would have liked to try. But I think that's where I probably would have focused my questions. So, yeah. Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Dimitry.
You mentioned that the Soviets were invited to co-prosecute.
Yes.
Why didn't they accept the invitation?
It's a great question.
Because they held similar trials about
it's a great question. So the way this all worked is that there was the first trial from 1945 to 1946, which is now in that movie that, you know, that's the object of the movie that came out in December. And then for the subsequent trials, the Americans were prosecuting as an occupation authority within their zone. Nuremberg was in their zone. Germany was divided into 4 zones. The French, the British, the British, and the Soviets and the Americans each had a zone. And there was something called Control Council Law number 10. The Control Council was running Germany. That was the government of Germany, and it was a combination of the occupation authorities. And each of them prosecuted their own cases in their own occupation zone. So the so-called subsequent Nuremberg trials that Ferencz worked on were the Americans running it. The Soviets had their own trials going. And I think there was a little bit, as did the French and British.
The crime scenes are all in the Soviet zone. Right?
Totally, and exceptionally, I think this was the only case where the Americans went to the Soviets and said, we'll co-prosecute with you, which would have made it the only one of the subsequent trials that would have been international. And the Soviets were seriously thinking about it. Another really interesting piece of trivia is that Fred Buren, who was the Swiss investigator who found the actual Einsatzgruppen documents, he's the one who went to the Soviets. Ferencz tasked him to go to the Soviets and ask if they would like to do the prosecution with the Americans. And apparently they were seriously thinking about it. So it's fascinating to know that there could have been a joint American-Soviet prosecution on this case. And I was hoping that you, given your own background, might bring that up, or I was going to talk about it when we had a chance to speak in private. I'm glad you brought it up here, because I think that was one of the great what-ifs. What if the Soviets and the Americans had prosecuted that case together? Would have been fascinating. So, lots of good stuff. I hope you'll all get a chance to read the book. And again, remember, I'm here to talk about it with anybody who would like, and I really appreciate your attention tonight. Thank you so much.